Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this beautiful photograph of an alpine meadow with a mountain in the background. The photograph is from Pixabay. I'll leave a link in the description below so that you can follow that if you want to paint along with this tutorial. I'm not going to copy it exactly, I'm just going to loosely base the painting on the composition because that's what I like, with the very sort of faded distant mountain, the plain sky and the lovely alpine meadow in the foreground, which I'm going to turn more into flowers than the kind of autumn seed heads that are in the photograph. I've just sketched out the very basic outline of the mountain and I've masked out a few flowers across the foreground so that I can paint in some more detailed ones over the top of my washes. This is Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board. My board's at an angle of about 45 degrees and I've wet my page all over, and now using my large Pro Art Ron Ranson Harkey brush I'm mixing up Paynes grey with a little bit of Venetian red, or you can use light red or burnt sienna. The first thing I want to do is to block in my mountain because I'm going to be using cling film or plastic food wrap, or glad wrap it's called in some countries, laid across the thick paint to give me the textures of the mountain. So as you can see, the paint is going on quite unevenly. I haven't mixed it on the palette, I've just picked it straight up onto my brush so that each brush stroke gives me a different combination of streaky colours of Paynes grey and the Venetian red. And this is starting off my textures quite beautifully. I'm going to thicken up the paint here and there, trying to imitate with my brushwork the kind of strata marks and lines of the mountain. And hopefully once I put the cling film across and it dries, it will give me some lovely rocky effects. So that will do, I think. I'm going to peel off a large piece of the plastic food wrap from the roll, and I shall lay it across the mountains, holding it quite tight to start with. And what it does, it kind of clings to the wet paint, and you can see, I think, it in the way the light's hitting it, you can see these kind of long, jagged sort of shard-like marks that are going in all sorts of different directions. And I'm fitting it on and pressing it down around the edges of the mountain and making sure that I've got good coverage and that it's pressed down in places. But you can see the raised areas are giving me some nice lines, and I'm hoping that once it dries, that's the sort of effect that I'll be left with. So now it needs to dry completely. It's completely dry now, so I'm peeling off my cling film, and you can see that it's created some lovely, almost looks like lino cut printing or something like that effects. I think it's really interesting the way the plastic presses down on the page and paint in some places and leaves those shard-like marks in others. So I'm going to continue with the painting now, and I'm going to pick up mostly raw sienna and a little bit of the Venetian red and a tiny touch of the Paynes grey onto my brush, and I'm going to put in a very simple base for my alpine meadow. I'm using vertical or slightly sloping, mostly vertical brush strokes and uneven colour again, to quickly and simply suggest the upward growth or vertical growth of the flowers and grasses and things like that. So I want my brushwork to show here. I'm not looking for a smooth foreground. I'm looking for texture that will start off my alpine meadow. And now I'm going to put in a very simple sky using what's left on my brush. It's very pale. I don't want anything busy going on because the mountain's got a lot of pattern in it, and my Alpine Meadow in the foreground is the focus. So I'm just going to brush across this kind of almost just dirty paint water across the sky area and allow that to dry. Now back to my foreground and just soften the transition between the mountains and the edge of the meadow so it's not quite as blunt. Just soften it off with a clean damp brush. Now I've got a little pan here in which I've got some Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white ink. You can use white gouache for this, mixed to an inky consistency, and I'm dropping it into my meadow area. I'm hoping that the ink or the white gouache will diffuse gently but leave me some lovely white areas to work with, to add extra texture and interest and sparkle to my meadow. Then going in with a little bit more ink and making some larger marks here and there, just to increase the texture and the amount of light in the meadow. And now finally, just before I leave it to dry, I'm going to sprinkle some table salt lightly across the areas to create hopefully some little flower shapes and little flower patterns, as the grains of salt will push away the paint and give me some pretty effects. And this is just a bit of paynes grey spattered in just to give me some dark. That will diffuse and just give me some subtle effects. Time to leave it to dry now. It's all dry, but I must admit I'm a bit underwhelmed. I think it looks interesting. I like the textures, but it's not really singing to me colour-wise. So I'm going to glaze it with Jackson's own brand Indigo artist quality paint. I've decided to make up quite a large amount of very watery glaze, and I'm going to go over the whole sky and mountain area, but not the meadow, because I want to lift it, and I think the blue will look beautiful and will knock back the mountain, bring out the sky, and then complement the meadow. This is, as I say, Jackson's Indigo. I think it's got quite a bit of phthalo blue in it. It's quite a staining colour, but it makes a lovely glaze. If you're going to glaze your painting, make sure that your painting is bone dry before you start, and then just use minimum amounts of brush work so that you don't disturb the paint underneath. And mix up enough paint to start with so you don't have to sort of stop halfway through to mix up some more, because you might end up with a streaky sky then. And I think you can see how much nicer that is already. That's really lit the painting up. And I'm very happy with that, and I'm going to continue now with the rest of the meadow. I have removed all my masking fluid from my flowers, and now I'm going to start to paint in a little bit more detail into them. This is my small calligraphy brush, and I've mixed up a bit of the indigo with some white gouache to give me a nice opaque pale blue, and I'm dotting this in, creating little groups of shadowy blue flowers, and that's going to link the blue in the sky and across the mountains with my meadow and give me some nice colour harmony. I'm making sure that I steer clear of the marks that I've already made and that have been created by the salt, which I have brushed off any residue of the salt. Most of it was gone, but I've brushed off the residue and it's left me some very pretty marks. So I'm working around those with my brush marks. And now for my main flowers, using my small calligraphy brush, I'm wetting each one of them in this first small group here. So I'm going to do these flowers bit by bit because I don't want them to dry. I want to paint each little flower wet in wet. So the first thing I'm going to do is, after I've wet each flower, is drop a little bit of this rich raw sienna into the base of the flower. Then once that's in, I shall go and drop in a bit of that indigo and white gouache mixture into the top. Now these, although they're tiny, they should look really effective when the raw sienna and the indigo and white gouache mixture sort of mix and blend together and diffuse on the paper. That should give me some really pretty sort of impressions of flowers, but without me having to put in too much detail. So I'll work across each of these little groups of the masked out flower heads in the same way, wetting them and then dropping in raw sienna at the base and the blue mixture at the top. Because the board's at an angle of 45 degrees, there's a bit of rundown of the paint as well, so that helps with the diffusion. Now you can see those flowers all look very pretty now, and I've built up some nice texture and tonal values across there as well. Now I'm going to mix up on my rigger, this is burnt umber, and I'm using the tip of the rigger to quickly put in some stems. So I'm putting in stems and grasses. I'm leading the lines with my rigger up to the flower heads or down from the flower heads, mostly vertical but tending towards the left or the right, slightly diagonal, to give me some variety. Different lengths, some of them curved, some of them straight. And I'll work across the whole of the foreground and the meadow, putting in these stems, trying to keep them looking sort of random and uneven, but all sort of growing upwards in the same sort of direction. Don't worry if this looks a little bit harsh at the moment. Once we go in with some more colour and flowers over the top of those stems, they should settle back a little bit more into the background and the flowers should become more prominent. And this is where you can refer back to the Pixabay photograph at the beginning to have a look at how the main stems of the main flowers grow up from the base or come out of the meadow in various different places, and just use that to sort of inspire the way you paint your marks here. If you prefer as well, rather than painting these in, you could finish off the meadow in the same sort of way as my wildflower meadow that I posted here last week, and you could use a black fine liner for the detail in your flowers and stems, leaves and grasses, and I think that would look very effective here too. And now I'm going to use my very useful Matthew Palmer tree and foliage stippling brush or texture brush, and I will stipple groups of flowers, sort of the impression of flowers across the whole meadow, using raw sienna, the lovely pale blue from the indigo and the white gouache, and white gouache itself. And I'll work across my foreground until I think I've got that effect. I'm going over the stems and leaves in places, pushing them back a bit further into the painting and bringing everything sort of together a bit more. I'm going to bring some of the flowers over the mountain area as well to sort of break up and soften the transition between mountain and meadow. Just finally a little tiny touch, very light, of white gouache over those main flowers just to give them slightly ragged edges. And I think that's me finished. I'm going to remove the tape and have a look at it. I'm a bit concerned about how dark it looks in the middle of the mountain now that I've got my flowers in. I think that's a bit distracting, but I'll have a look at it and assess that once the white border is there, because that will help me to look at it with fresh eyes. But I think apart from that, I'm very happy with it. But I think if you look closely here along this edge just here, it's a bit harsh and it's a bit too dark. And it does distract the eye. So I'm taking my soft squirrel mop brush. It's damp, and I'm going to rub it across that mark and just get a bit of water, not too much, because I want to gently see if I can dab off some of the paint. So I'm loosening it up very carefully because I don't want to make really nasty big marks and lift off all the paint to the white of the paper. I just want to soften back so that there's not so many dark marks in that area, so that the eye isn't distracted by them. I think slowly but surely, I think that's making quite a lot of difference actually. Instead of being like really dark, it's almost like a pale grey. So now that just looks like a bit, the part of the mountain that's closest to us with more distant ones behind it. Yes, I'm much happier with that now. It doesn't distract from the flowers. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you can see how using the cling film and rich paint has given us some lovely effects quite simply for the mountain. And then glazing over the sky and the mountain really brought out the colour of the meadow, whereas it was a little bit dull before. And then mixing the white gouache with the indigo has given us some sort of extra depth really to the meadow, and the pale cornflower blue is really pretty against the raw sienna and all the other sort of tones and hues in that meadow. Well, thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done already. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon. Take care then. Bye.